Hello, everyone. Welcome to another installment on our 2020 virtual Global and Community Engagement Conference, formerly known as the 80. The conference is dialogue and celebration of our efforts to solve issues that confront the world's poorest 80%. Traditionally, it's a one-day conference featuring multiple in-person panels and breakout sessions. However, this year, the conference is being delivered virtually throughout the month of October, including a lecture series, a Rotsa gallery exhibit, and a walking tour, and a series of online interviews with local and global change makers throughout the Michigan Tech community. My name is Myra Sanchez Morgan, and I'm a member of the conference planning committee. Today, I have the pleasure, a real pleasure for me, to interview my friend Val Gagnon. Val, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing your last name properly.
I've heard it pronounced many ways, but I pronounce it Ganyu.
Gagnon. Val Gagnon. Thank you for that one. I'll practice for next time.
Okay.
Well, I met Val when I was starting my PhD in environmental and energy policy at Michigan Tech. Val was already an advanced student and she helped me a lot. And I remember I felt really engaged with the work she was doing with indigenous communities then. We have very good conversation and we exchange about our backgrounds because in my family there are also Mayan indigenous peoples and Val was working um, with indigenous people here. So not only Val helped me a lot when I started my program, we have continued being friends and colleagues all this time. So it's my pleasure to interview Val today. Val, thank you so much for your time.
Of course.
I just want to say a little bit. Val, of course, Val graduated from my program, and Val now works as a director of a partnership between Michigan Tech and indigenous communities at the Great Lakes Research Center. Val, please correct me if I'm wrong on what I'm saying. And she's also a research assistant professor at the College of Forest Resources and Environmental Science. Is that correct, Val?
It is. Mm-hmm.
Okay, great. Well, let's start with this interview. Val, tell me a little bit more about about your work and the project you're currently working at Michigan Tech and with your partnership with indigenous communities.
Sure. Um, I saw your question, and so I'll just jump in to responding. But in all honesty, my work is many things. Um, being the director for University-Indigenous community partnerships, it's really my responsibility to help support and guide different researchers who desire to work with Indigenous communities on a whole range of research. And so, really, I got started, uh, you know, before we had met. I started working with the Keweenaw Indian community who resides in Michigan in the Upper Peninsula along the shores of Lake Superior. And since that time, it has really grown to do other kinds of work with some other Great Lakes tribes and the Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission. My work in environmental and energy policy uh, was and still is rooted in the importance of learning more about toxic substances and how that impacts the social and cultural and biophysical well-being of communities who are dependent on the fish harvest for subsistence, for commercial fisheries, and just livelihoods and cultural identity. So for the past couple of years working at the Great Lakes Research Center, I my work has really expanded into different areas. because tribal communities are interested and value the research of many different kinds of disciplines. And so now one of the projects that I am working on with Michigan Sea Grant and Keweenaw Bay Indian Community and um, Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission is compiling Indigenous knowledge and creating a knowledge guidance document for the community. We know as researchers that many people are interested in how to bridge different knowledge systems. Some researchers think and talk about this as traditional ecological knowledge and the ways that both traditional knowledge and scientific knowledge are equally valuable. And so, what can we do to address problems, environmental problems, by using both of those knowledge sets? I am also very involved in food sovereignty initiatives and that kind of work. Food sovereignty is about communities having autonomy in the decisions and choices related to their own food systems. That ability to feed themselves and feed themselves well, having their culturally appropriate foods, and also their own ideas of what cultural well-being is. And not just in research, but also there's so much to learn from Indigenous communities. And so there's also been some new partnerships gained. For example, the Pavlis Honors College and their Community Ambassadors Program. So Keweenaw Bay Indian Community and their Natural Resources Department has hosted a couple of community ambassadors. The College of Engineering and senior design teams have worked with KBIC. And now computer science and designing an app. It's all about different fishing lakes and also advisory information. And there is another group, I believe they're in engineering, but that project has just started working with Keweenaw Bay Indian Community about the further developing some solar energy on the reservation. And the reservation is about 30 miles south of Michigan Tech. And so, yeah, all of these partnerships have just really expanded. And when I say researchers, I mean faculty, staff, and graduate students and undergrads. So there's so many wonderful things that are taking place and really working to rebuild and strengthen the relationship between the university and Keweenaw Bay Indian Community.
Well, but all those projects sound really interesting for me. And I want to ask you a follow-up question to that.
Mm-hmm.
My understanding is that you are building bridges, right?
Yeah.
Between what is considered the Western science or knowledge and the traditional tribal science and knowledge.
Yeah.
What are the challenges that you face in your work for not just the Western scientific community, versus the tribal knowledge and understanding that is this knowledge and this is equal and either although it represents two different groups, it's just as valuable and it should be treated with the same equity. So what are the challenges that you face on this partnership that you were talking that you do on a daily basis?
Yeah, I think there are different sets of challenges. and I think I can really summarize them by just saying that we have a lot of unlearning to do. Um, and before we can really move forward in learning these new ideas, like equitable knowledge systems. Um, but I also see a lot of hope. There's so much willingness to learn by tribal communities and researchers, and to me, that's really grown so much. Like just in the last 5 years,
Mhm.
I remember, the work that I do has been interesting to many people for a while, but they weren't as interested as getting engaged, right, in doing similar kinds of engagement with their work and communities. And I think that has really grown. I also really like the visual that you provided about like building bridges, and I also I think sometimes people get confused, or they might assume like I'm a bridge, um, and that people can use that bridge or like use me to connect with others so they can do the work that they desire. But I try to, as I'm building those relationships with researchers as well, I try to explain that really, I'm not the bridge. I can help with some of those connections, but if people are interested in being a part of the partnership, then they have to contribute to building and strengthening that bridge as well. We all have different skills and tools and methods, and it's going to take all of those to maintain and keep that bridge strong. And it'll be an ongoing process. You can't just leave that bridge there to deteriorate. It's something that has to be really cared for and attended to. Um, I think so. Those challenges, one of them is that people aren't familiar with seeing traditional knowledge systems as equally valuable as Western science. Um, I recently heard an Indigenous person from the St. Regis Mohawk tribe. He is Akwesasne, and he said something about um, some of the longest data sets in environmental science are about 100 years old, and those are like really important. But some of the longest knowledge systems in Indigenous communities are thousands of years old, and they're rooted to place, and those are things that weren't part of our education, right? We didn't learn those things. And so we're having to learn those. And the other one is just really sharing with others that uh, they they can contribute to building the partnership and strengthening these partnerships between the university and different communities. And Indigenous communities want that. There's a lot of skills and a lot of knowledge at Michigan Tech. Um, and there's a lot of skills and knowledge in different Indigenous communities. And when those are put together, it's much more than the sum of its parts, right? So I think that we have different strengths. Um, each knowledge system has different strengths. Um, and I think the last challenge that I'll address has to do with uh, some researchers when they approach me with their interest in connecting with communities or community members. People often ask me, um, what what does it take to build a partnership with a tribal community? And so many times I'll turn that back around and I'll ask them, what does it take to build a trusting partnership? Like, we know what that takes. It takes that time of engaging with each other, and mutual respect, having shared experiences, getting to know each other. All of those contribute to building trust between different people and different organizations. So really, we do, in many ways, we know how to do those, but it's hard work. It's
Right.
investment, and many times the time and effort that you put into those partnerships, that's what you're going to get out of it. So yeah, I would say that that summarizes my challenges pretty well.
Yeah, I hear what you're saying. And when we were building this conference and we came up with the mission of this year, which is the pursuit of social equity and representation, right? And that's very close to what you do. And
Mhm.
that's also very close. Those are the challenges that you're facing in order to bring this representation of knowledge
Mhm.
in
Yes.
equally,
Yes.
right? That acknowledging that what tribal communities bring, that this Asian knowledge and this Asian relationship with nature, with between them, it's really important.
Yeah.
And we didn't discover them when we start talking about them,
Yes.
right? We didn't discover issues in the Great Lakes or with water or food. They
Mhm.
knew about that and they already have a relationship with it,
Yes.
right? So I'm very this is exciting for me. There is someone like you working on this partnership, um, because as you said, as you mentioned, it's there's a lot of challenge
Mhm.
to achieve this social equity and this representation.
Yeah.
And I know you have been working on this partnership not just when you started at Michigan Tech, your PhD degree, and currently your position as a as an assistant professor and as a director. You have been immersed on this community. This has been part of your life. So I would like to ask you, how does the involvement, personal and professional involvement, has changed you, has evolved with the years?
Yeah, that's a huge question.
I know.
It, I Many times I forget to let people know when I introduce myself that I am not a tribal member. But I am very much a community member,
Mhm,
and I do live in Lance, um, within the Lance Indian Reservation that was established with the Treaty of 1854. And all of us throughout the Western Upper Peninsula are within Anishinaabe homelands
mhm,
established by the 1842 treaty. Um, and just having first learned that part, that had an impact on me personally, that I, at the time, had already lived here for a few years, but did not recognize that I was on tribal lands, that I was in many ways a guest. Um, and that these lands and the place where my home is really on lands that don't necessarily belong to me. And if we're thinking about indigenous ways of knowing, um, they don't, they're not anybody's property, really. Um, and other ways, when we think about how the more I learned, the more it just transformed the way that I could see. we don't realize sometimes how narrow our lenses are. And not just what we can see, but even what we can hear. Um, I I recognize more that there's many ways that living beings around us communicate with us and share their lessons with us. I I my experience, my daily experience is much different than it used to be. But it was a process. It didn't happen overnight at all. Um, but it's been a huge blessing to me. I've learned so much from the people here about how to be a better neighbor in this world. Not just a human neighbor, but also a good neighbor to the trees, a good neighbor to the water, and to all the plants and all the living beings, um, and to be more respectful of those relationships as well. Because ultimately, that's what we should be doing, being respectful of others' autonomy, including the fish and the birds
Mm-hmm.
and the trees. Um, and so, yeah, these were slow and steady lessons. Um, and I'm really grateful to all my teachers here, um, and and teachers being other living beings as well. I did have one comment about the conference, if you don't mind me
Of
adding.
course, please. I would love that.
So one of the things I noticed was, and I understand why, the can you remind me what the name of the conference is? Global,
Sure. Global and Community Engagement Conference,
yeah,
formerly
Global and Community
GAD.
Engagement.
Mm-hmm.
And it used to be D80, and that's focusing
Mm-hmm.
on the 80% of the population that is poor. And I think for that struck me in a way, in a different kind of way, um, because even so, that 80% is still, associated with this global and community engagement
Mm-hmm.
conference. Um, I don't consider myself working with those who are poor or disadvantaged. I consider myself working with and beside people who are incredibly knowledgeable and powerful. And I think poor, 80% poor, like how you define what's rich. Um, and so it kind of struck me, in a different way, like, hey, wait a minute, that's not how I represent myself, that I'm advocating on behalf of the 80% poor. No, I'm advocating uh, for the restoration of land and life. Um, and and so one of the ways I think in representation, we can go a long way with, what do we mean by, excuse me. So I had a dryness in my
You're
throat.
fine. That happens to me all the time.
You can edit that out. So I was kind of thinking about how could the representation of global and community engagement also represent that um, that knowledge and that power and sovereignty. So a while back ago, I pulled some information together, and you might be familiar with this as others who do similar kinds of work about Indigenous people and are stewards of about 20% of the
Mhm,
Earth's mass, and that land harbors 80% of the world's remaining biodiversity.
mhm,
And also, there's a direct correlation between language diversity and biodiversity.
mhm.
And so we're talking about Indigenous people being like 5 or 6% of the world's population, but
Right.
they're responsible for 80% of the physical biodiversity and 90% of the cultural diversity.
Mhm.
And so I think those are better representations of what the conference is.
No, but I really appreciate your comment. Currently, we're in the process of transition from, what people know as deity to something that represents and something that engage different groups to start a conversation about, social equity, about community engagement. So we are in that process. So your comment is really pertinent. And I think it's going to be even more pertinent for when we're starting to think about for, next year conference. I agree with you. For instance, one of the things I wanted to bring to for joining the committee was like representation is not necessary. Knowledge, social equity, that we also need to expand beyond Michigan Tech, beyond the area as well. Because there are other, for instance, one of the interviews that I'm trying to to do is with the Mayan indigenous people that have a very successful ecotourism project in the Yucatan. Because we need to also look at what other places, how does it look like, in other areas. Not, I agree with you talking about the poor. That's uh, how do you define the rich, right? How do
Yeah.
you define? Because this community, if you talk about the Mayans, for instance, oh, the first thing you say they are in poverty and in this, but when you look at this group, what they're doing, they are not poor, and the relationship, they are very rich, and they consider themselves rich.
Yeah.
Why? Because they are very proud of the relationship they have with the environment. They are very proud of the successful project. They are making very good profit. So those are also the conversation and the groups that we need to bring, right? And show and start establishing those bridges as well. Which representation we're talking here, right? Representing
Yes.
who and how to.
Hmm.
Because I don't want to say, oh, look at this group of Mayan, poor Mayan
I
people
know.
that
Yeah.
did that, right? That's
Yeah.
not what we want. And I agree with you. That's not what we're talking when we are tribal communities as well.
Yes.
Right. So that's
So
what we are. So that's what I wanted to invite you. That's what I wanted to invite other, because those are the type of conversation that we need to start looking at. We need to
yes.
start having when we're talking about a conference about community engagement.
Hmm.
You know.
Yes, and it would be, looking at like the work on data sovereignty, for example, and uh, the way that different researchers collect all this data on disparities,
Mm-hmm.
and not collecting data on the kinds of things that people are doing to empower
Mm-hmm.
themselves. Um, and here is another example, similar to the one that you just talked about in the Mayan culture, but the Western Upper Peninsula is recognized as a food desert, which means it has to
Mm-hmm.
do with all these different kinds of factors about distance to grocery stores and fresh fruits and vegetables. And there's people here within the KBIC who says, this is not a food desert. Our landscape and our waters are rich with foods and medicines. They're everywhere and they're here every season. We do not live in a food desert. Um, so it's not that we don't need to do better within uh, what
Right.
kinds of foods are available, because we do. But food desert is the wrong term. It does
Mhm.
not represent Keweenaw Bay Indian community and many neighboring communities who are hunters and fishers and gatherers, who are non-tribal people
Mhm.
too, are reliant on the waters and the forests for foods in our region. So um, yeah, and I think those things are important to talk about and not just focus on the disparities.
Right. I totally agree with you, and I really like that you bring this up because those, as I said, those are the conversations that we need to have and we need to start looking at.
Mm-hmm.
This that because we also need to, as we're talking, analyze how do we want to present representation of whom and how,
Mm-hmm.
right? That I think those are the conversations that we need to do because otherwise it looks like sometimes something that made me feel a little bit uncomfortable is like when we talk to people who are doing work, we always say what they are working for and not with. So
Yes.
they are doing this. So you are using all the power and you're bringing them to them, and you're missing this part that they are powerful. They are very engaging. It's not necessarily a partnership. So how do you represent when you're saying, "Oh, this community, this group, or this person, or this researcher, right, or this institution is working for"?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's not the type of engagement we want to present or we want to
Yeah.
talk. There's
Yeah.
a lot of that
And
because this is a this again those power relations that we don't like. Those power relations that it's there's always a power and powerless even with good intention, which is not the type of social equity they were looking. They want to discuss. There's not the representation. This type of engagement that we want.
right.
So Val, this has been really a very good conversation. Just to wrap up, um, what would you say to, for instance, to the Michigan Tech community student and staff that would like to know more about the tribal communities, about the treaties, about this partnership? Where can they start? If someone say, mm, where can they start?
Well, I think a good starting point would be on my profile on the Great Lakes Research Center page. I offer a number of links there that they can learn more from the Keweenaw Bay Indian community, their
Mm-hmm,
Natural Resources Department website, um, Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission and their website. There are so many resources out there. I don't think people realize that there are 12 federally recognized tribes in the state of Michigan. 5 of them are in the Upper Peninsula, and they all have resources. Many of them have their own colleges and their own governments. And so there is a lot of information out there. So that's why I just have a selection right there um, on my profile. There are also different story maps and video series. These
mm-hmm,
incredible stories like the Ogichita storytellers and the
mm-hmm,
ways.org. And through all of those materials, they are connections to even more materials.
mm-hmm.
So I think that could be a good starting point. Um, and if you're at Michigan Tech, you can send me an email. You can come and see me. You can start getting engaged in some of this work. There are also many events that take place at Michigan Tech
Mm-hmm.
that partners with uh, Keweenaw Bay Indian community. And then the tribe themselves has a number of events throughout the year. There is Lake Superior Day, beach cleanups, the water walk that starts with the water ceremony. There are the Natural Resources Department loves student volunteers and student interns.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, yeah, the learning opportunities. There's tribes have done an incredible work on putting and creating resources to share more about who they are, and the work that they do. Um, yeah, Google is will give so many things out there,
Mm-hmm.
as resources. And the other thing, it connects to something else that you said before about communities sharing knowledge with each other. And Indigenous communities have been doing that since time immemorial, you know,
Mm-hmm.
and sharing different tools and skills and foods and all kinds of things with each other since they were on this continent and others.
Mm-hmm.
And those uh, communities were constantly adapting and adopting new practices and new seeds and all kinds of things. And that's just only continued. And any of us can be a part of that, right? I am an Indigenous person to South Korea, but I can be a community member here too, and share my knowledge and skills to do good work here. And that goes for anybody, whoever you are.
Well, thank you so much to Dr. Gagnon.
Mhm. Yeah, thank
I did
you.
a better job this time. And just to finish, what would be the best way to contact you? Can you please tell us your email or your, if you go to your,
Email
you
is
have
good.
office hours, or what would be the best way to contact you?
Email is good. Right now, I'm still working from home, especially since I live in a different county. I think it's just more responsible. One day we'll be back to semi normal. Um, I also have an office phone number and I get my messages through email as well. So, yep.
Can you tell us your email for the people that are not related to Michigan Tech that will be watching this interview, your email and your phone number, your office phone number where they can leave messages, please?
Yeah, so my email is vsganu. Um, and my work phone is 906-487-2180.
I will thank you so much to Val.
Thank you
This
for
has been
inviting me. That was
amazing.
very, very meaningful. A change maker. That's awesome. We should
Because
all be
you are,
change makers.
you are, you are. Thank you for all the work you're doing and your commitment and your passion too. I